Hey guys, and welcome to another one of my lore videos. Today I'm going to be talking about the statues and headstones you find dotted around in Bloodborne. Both the statues and the headstones you can find literally everywhere. You can't go 5 feet without tripping over one, especially in the city of Yharnam itself. You find them outside people's houses, in the streets. You go further into the Forbidden Woods, in the Nightmare Frontier. You find them everywhere. And what's most interesting for, I think, especially Westerners, is how they're placed. They're usually, with the headstones at least, you'd expect them to be side by side, each one marking a grave. And the first instinct, I think, as a Westerner, is to assume that they mark people's graves. But the way they're placed so randomly, sometimes, like I said, outside people's houses, and if they're not outside people's houses, they're all like bunched together. It just seems very strange. And people can't seem to make sense of that for the headstones. With the statues, yeah, you can actually say with the statues it doesn't really matter, but still they're very, very strange in their placement, and nobody can really figure out why that is. As far as the statues go, there's three main types that you find. You've got the ones that look like people beckoning the sky with their hands raised in the air. You've got the ones that are basically Great One statues, which kind of makes sense, that's obviously depictions of the great ones, which makes sense from a religious iconography standpoint. And you've got the ones that are little animals that you find, especially dotted around the city of Yharnam. Interestingly enough, if you go to Old Yharnam, you find that some of the statues are actually chained up. They've got chains wrapped around them, and that's really strange as well. And that's only in Old Yharnam, and nobody can really understand why that is. And as far as the headstones go, one of the things you notice about them is that they actually get larger as you go further into the game. The headstones you find in the Yharnam city are pretty normal, but if you go further in, they get very strange. In the Forbidden Woods, you get giant headstones, and you get headstones which look like they've got amygdala head imprints in them. Small amygdala heads, which is really strange. And you've got some that are shaped like eggs, which don't really make a lot of sense either for people. And then obviously you've got the giant ones. Are they the headstones for marking the graves of a great one? Maybe, but that doesn't really make any sense in my mind considering their random placement. And if you go into the Nightmare Frontier, what you find is that the giant headstones, some of them are cracked open and contain blood and sinew, which makes no sense at all either. So, like I said, as a Westerner, I found this really strange at first and I couldn't really understand it. So, how do we explain this? Well, two main religions in Japan are Buddhism and Shintoism. Buddhism obviously comes from India and came through into Japan via China, but Shinto is the actual native religion of Japan. And Shinto is very much concerned with ideas of impurity and purification. And these ideas represent the constant internal struggle between good and evil that exists within all men. This idea of being impure is related to evil and bad thoughts, and purification is a way to make yourself good, to actually remove the evil from you. And if you look deeply into the theology of Shinto, you find that there's a concept of something called a kami, which is basically in English can be defined as a god or a spirit or some kind of spiritual essence, and generally alludes to the energy generated by a thing. And you'll often find that kami is represented by real and mythical creatures such as wolves and dragons. But in a larger extent, kami can actually be elements of the landscape. Kami can be a forest, the force of nature, lightning, wind, and it can basically be represented by beings that express certain qualities. Now, closely tied to kami is this idea of a yorishiro. A yorishiro is basically an object that's capable of attracting spirits or kami and giving them a physical space to occupy. Now, that's for me, when I read that, that was really interesting because if you really think about it, in Bloodborne, what are the Yharnamites, what are the Healing Church trying to do? They're trying to attract the Great Ones. And so, maybe to the Yharnamites, the statues and headstones placed around the city are Yorishiro. That would explain a lot. Because, like I said, the Yharnamites are trying to attract the Great Ones using different methods. They use rituals, which include, babies and sacrifices, and maybe these objects, the statues and headstones, are just another way of attracting them. And when developing the game, From Software were channeling this idea of Yorishiros, which are basically ways to attract the Japanese kamis. If you really think about it, some of these statues literally look up to the sky with their hands outstretched as if they're trying to beckon something. So that kind of makes sense from a representational point of view. We can actually go further. In Shinto, there's also something called a kadomatsu, which can be literally translated as a gate tree or a gate pine tree. And in traditional Japanese New Year celebrations, these kadomatsu are placed in front of people's homes to welcome ancestral spirits or kamis as part of a harvest. And if you recall, I said earlier that you often find that the statues and the headstones are placed directly in front of people's homes in Yharnam. There's also a tradition in Japan known as Moneki Nikyo, which basically means beckoning cat. And that's really just a common Japanese figurine, which is basically a talisman. If you think of it as a talisman or a lucky charm, you kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about here. They're basically placed in front of people's homes, but most likely in front of businesses to bring in prosperity. They're considered to be good luck. So in the same way, I think the Yharnamites put these statues, these gravestones, in front of their homes to bring good luck, to try and attract the great ones to themselves, as a way of trying to say, oh look, I'm a good person, I'm looking for enlightenment. Please come to my home, great one. It sounds quite strange when you think of it like that, but it's a well-worn idea in Japanese religion. Now, even more interesting is that if you look really closely at some of the giant headstones in the Forbidden Woods, you'll see invertebrates clinging onto the headstones, hundreds, if not thousands of them. And of course, the invertebrates are the familiars of the Great Ones. They're used to try and contact them. So isn't that really interesting? Something that you use to contact a Great One, you'll find in the headstone itself. That's just more evidence in my mind that the headstones are basically a way to try and contact the Great Ones. They are the Yorishiro. Now, remember I also mentioned earlier that some of the statues in Old Yharnam were chained up. Now, initially, as a Westerner, I always associate chains with oppression. So I thought to myself, seems to be some kind of way of, precluding something's power, or to try and, negate the effect of a certain statue or what it represents. But then I came across this Japanese term called shimenawa, which basically refers to an object which is a rope made of laid rice straw, which is used as part of ritual purification in the Shinto religion. Interestingly enough, they're also used around the Yorishiro. So certain objects, such as trees, which are capable of attracting the spirits or the kami, or in this case the great ones, have these shimenawa placed around them. And once it's been placed around a Yorishiro, it represents the fact that this Yorishiro contains a kami inside it. And obviously in Shinto, it means that this tree or this object is sacred. And I think what's happening in Old Yharnam is that the residents of the Old Yharnam, maybe during the time of a blood moon, or when the Great Ones are descending, believe that they'd made contact with the Great Ones, and as such put the chains around the statues to represent them as holy, saying, "Oh, the blood moon is here, the Great Ones are here, so our statues, which are our Yorishiro, have drawn out the spirits of the Great Ones. So we're going to change them up to represent the fact that these are holy statues now." Again, that sounds quite strange to a Westerner, but it does seem to make sense in the context of the Shimenawa and the Yorishiro objects I talked about. And by the way, human beings can also be possessed, for lack of a better term, by a kami. A famous example would be the sumo wrestlers in Japan. The highest rank of a sumo wrestler is a yokozuna, and when they achieve this rank, they're given a ceremonial rope, which basically is the shimenawa, which they wrap around their body during entrance ceremonies, and they're basically seen as a living Yorishiro, which is inhabited by the spirit of a kami. Now, one of the strangest things I've seen in Bloodborne is the giant headstones in the Nightmare Frontier, which I mentioned earlier. Some of them are cracked open, and you can see inside them seem to be a lot of blood and guts and sinew and blood of a living creature. Now, that never made any sense in my mind at all. I couldn't really understand. I don't think anyone really knows what it is. But recently I came across this tradition of Buddhist monks that would entomb themselves living within the statue or basically shrine within a Buddhist statue or shrine. And basically they would go in there living and basically die in there as some kind of method to achieve enlightenment. And again, I could definitely believe that what's contained in these headstones that we see is basically the blood and guts and dead bodies of Yharnamites who either sacrificed themselves or basically killed as part of some kind of ritual and placed in the headstone as a way of trying to attract the great ones or the kami, depending on what you want to call them. And finally, the little animal statues that you find, especially early on in the city of Yharnam, these are really interesting, and I think these basically speak to the tradition of shishi, as it's known in Shinto, or basically the traditional stone guards that you find outside the gates of most Japanese Shinto shrines. These are usually either lions or wolves or foxes, and sometimes the shrine themselves worship these animals. So, as a Westerner, like I said, I find it very difficult to really understand these things the first time around, especially since at least on a surface level, Bloodborne has a very Western aesthetic. But I think the deeper you dig into it, the more you find these Japanese and especially Shinto religious influences. And it goes deeper than that as well. There's more to it than what I've just described in this video. I'm actually going to be discussing a lot of the influences of the game in upcoming videos, especially the influences on the lore. So you guys can look forward to that. Cheers.